Hello and welcome to the Sensibly Speaking podcast. This is Chris Shelton, the critical thinker at large, coming at you for, I think this is show number 107, brought to you on Stitcher, Google Play, iTunes, as an audio podcast, as well as here on YouTube with video. And those of you who are watching on YouTube can see I am joined this week again by Rachel Bernstein, one of my most favorite people to talk to about this subject matter and just about anything in general, really. And so welcome, Rachel, to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here. And hello, everybody.
Yes. So we're going to talk this week about second gen cult members or destructive cult members or group members, right? This is, we'll probably talk about Scientology stuff. But but it's going to be broad enough that I think, or at least my intention is that we talk broadly enough that we encompass second gen members, and of course third, fourth, fifth gen members of any group, any high control destructive cult type group out there. So first off, let's go ahead and describe what are we talking about? What does that mean, second gen? What does that bring to mind for you? What do you understand that to mean?
Right. There have been a lot of terms that have been used for this population. The born and raised is what they sometimes go by, born and raised in a particular group. Second gen, now third, fourth, you name the number. Cults have been around now for, well, I think forever, really. But in terms of how we define them now and the groups that we know of, second, third, fourth generation members exist. I've been working with them. Also, I think to add into that, people who were brought into a group at a very young age, before
Right.
they really, right, so that they weren't born into it, but maybe 2, 3, 4, even 5, maybe 6, they really haven't had a chance to develop a sense of who they are and be in the world and learn life skills and social skills. And so it's as though they were born and raised in it. And so these are people who were raised in an environment that was not of their choosing. And that changes everything for them because that adds to the confusion about why this had to happen to them. And also it adds to a feeling of, at times, great resentment towards the people who brought them into this, that made them feel like a fish out of water.
Yeah, for sure, actually. I guess as far as what you were mentioning about age there, that would apply to me because I was not born in, my parents weren't Scientologists when I was first born, but they got involved, I think, when I was about 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have very, very few memories
Mm-hmm.
prior to, having a Scientology influence in my life.
Right, right. Yeah, similar
Yeah,
sort of thing. Right.
yeah.
So that when I work with people who have gotten involved in a group, I never want to say they joined because you don't, right? You don't join a cult, you get brought in or sucked in. When they're older, they really then, as part of their healing, can go back to this reference point of how they were before, what their relationships were like before, what they knew to be true about themselves, proof that they had in their life that they were capable of thinking for themselves, etc., what their interests were, their moral code, all of it, and some social skills thrown in to boot. But people born and raised or second gen, third gen, or brought in at a young age don't have that frame of reference, unfortunately. And then it starts really with needing to address the programming that took place at a very young age where you really believe that is you, or that is what you are supposed to be like, or that is what you truly believe in, but it might not be the case. So yes,
Yeah,
it does also apply to you.
yeah, for sure. And we're hitting on something I was actually going to ask you about next. So this is a good segue here, which is one of the things that you, Steve Hassan, some other cult recovery experts have spoken about is the fact that when a person joins a high control group, which is personality driven by a leader or leaders, you have a personality transfer of sorts. I don't know any formal words for this, but basically, because a person joins into one of these high control groups where they're subject to indoctrination, education,
Mm-hmm.
a whole culture of being immersed in the personality of the leader, they
Mm-hmm.
tend to start taking on the personality quirks and traits and ideas of the cult leader and
Mm-hmm.
make them their own to such a degree that their personality shifts and changes and they become a different person, which is
Mm-hmm.
what I think what you were just referring to, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so part of, dealing with recovery for a person who finally escapes such a group is finding that earlier frame of reference when they weren't in the cult and building back up the actual personality of the person.
Mm-hmm.
And I just went over all that just to, if nobody's familiar with this concept already from earlier episodes where we've talked about this in detail. So, how does that work though for somebody who was, you know, all of their memories go back to this being part of this group?
Of the people I work with who were born and raised in, or just raised from a young age in groups that were highly controlled, highly controlling, you have something similar to someone who was raised in a household with a very, very domineering parent or parents. You also have it with certain people who were raised in certain neighborhoods, certain religious neighborhoods, where there were certain ways of believing and behaving, certain rules that you needed to follow. What you also have with these people who leave these environments is that they don't really know how to interact with people outside. And they are very worried also that the person who is in charge of them, who has often made them feel scared about interacting with the world outside, they wonder if they're right, that something bad is going to happen to them, that there's danger lurking around every corner, that they're going to be exposed to something that is going to take them away from the path or, whatever, where all the answers lie. And so a lot of people I talk to either were raised in these environments where they had no exposure to other people. They weren't allowed to go to schools or even doctors who were outside of this organization, this group, this cult. They had no way of seeing that other people could be living perfectly fine and happy lives without believing the same way, without following the same leader. And then there are other people who were exposed. They did go to a particular school in their neighborhood, or they were allowed to follow whomever to the market and have exposure to the world outside, even in small ways. But they had been taught to keep blinders on so that if they did see someone else who seemed to be fine, who was not of the same belief system, well, they just were fine for now. But something bad is going to happen to them down the road because they don't have the answer. They're not following the same way, and you're not supposed to associate with them. Sometimes people were told that those people have some sort of negative power that then can seep into them if they get too close to that person. Usually also a lot of these groups survive as long as they do by having so much secrecy. So you learn not to share the secrets. And you learn that it's for your own benefit, but really it's for the leader's benefit. So he or she can keep getting away with it. So you already have this separation emotionally, socially from the world outside. And then you don't really feel like you have a place there, wherever there is outside
Yeah.
of the group. And then it's safer, even if you're being abused, even if you're being at the very least mistreated, but at the most abused, still you are made to feel that you're safer there than outside of the group.
And so, how does this sort of thing get addressed from a counseling perspective? Like when you're dealing with somebody who comes in from this, like what's the basic approach? Because I know every single person is dealt with differently. And I'm not trying to suggest that, there's a one size fits all solution for everybody.
Right. Right.
But what's the basic approach in dealing with, second gen members?
Okay, so there's so many. Okay, so number one, first of all, I want to say before even dealing with them, I want to give them a huge amount of credit for even wanting to tackle this because it is overwhelming. And it shows, I think, also how much strength it takes to kind of come back to a place, or to introduce yourself to a place that you want to be, the world you want to live in, how you want to feel inside in your own mind and your own heart. And that you want to do that work, as hard as that is. And it shows me a lot about human resilience, that, you know, that second gens are wanting to take this on and wanting to live a better life, a happier life. So where I usually start is by having them describe to me what their life was like and what they came to believe was true about them, about their thoughts, their feelings, and then be able to differentiate with them those beliefs with what they've come, now that they've left, what they've come to sort of wonder might actually really be more accurate about them. And sometimes people don't know what's truly accurate about them if they don't pay attention, if they're too worried about paying attention to that. Meaning, your first, usually subconscious reaction to something in that split second is your actual response to it, not your learned response, not your trained response. And so I will sometimes ask people to look around the room and tell me how they feel about what they just saw, or a poster that I have with a certain message. What were they thinking initially? And then what were they taught to think about it? That was their second thought. And so to get people into what their first thought was, the instinctive piece of them, the authentic piece of them, without fear induction, kind of dismissing it, without other kind of language being used to describe it, but before, what they really thought. And it could also be that it wasn't a thought, it was a feeling, that they got a feeling in the pit of their stomach, or tightening in their shoulders, or something that released adrenaline in their system for whatever reason. What made them feel that way? That's part of who they are. That's part of their construction. That's part of their own wiring, separate from any other influence. So it's to help people read themselves, because they'll get a lot of information when they read themselves. It's like when people start dating someone and everyone else can see that this isn't the right person for them and this isn't a good person for them to be with, and they kind of knew it themselves, but they ignored it. That was their first instinct, but the second instinct was, but they're so cute, or, you know, I don't want to be single anymore, or what, you know, all the other thoughts. But to go back to the initial reaction. The other part is, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say that's fascinating, and a clever way of getting to the bottom of where this person's really at, you know, and what their real views are on things, and who they really are deep down, you know, and sort of drawing that out of them. I'm fascinated by this.
You know, actually, there's been an interesting kind of cross-cultural dialogue with. I was talking to some people who were raised in white supremacist groups who have since left.
I was just thinking about inbred racism and bigotry and this. So it's so funny you mentioned that. Yeah, what happened?
So this one man I was talking to said that he remembers being indoctrinated at a young age, being taken into neighborhoods, people of different races than his family. And his initial instinct was to kind of look out the car window and go, hey, like, oh, someone my age, or oh, I have the same truck, or whatever, you know. And instead, you know, the car doors were locked because there was supposedly this danger lurking, and you weren't supposed to have any kind of communication with them. And within the car, as they're driving by, were all these descriptive words being used about what he was seeing outside the car windows. And then he was instructed to lower the windows and yell out these things, which he didn't feel at all, which he didn't believe at all. But after a while, he needed to be accepted by and not rejected by the only people who he was relying on to take care of him. So it was a survival mechanism. And then he started believing some of the messages to a certain degree, but he liked the power that he felt. So some of it was like half belief, half, but it makes me feel kind of on top of my game and powerful that I can kind of, you know, yell something at someone and drive away in my car, you know, whether that's real power or not, and it's not, but still in the moment, it felt like it was. But But talking to him, I said, do you remember when you first were driving through those neighborhoods? And he said, yeah, there were so few kids my age in our group that I was so excited to see this kid. And he's African American, and he had the same truck. It was like this Tonka truck that I had. And I wanted to say, cool truck. And that was my initial response. It was noticing how we were the same, not different. But I was
Right.
trained to see how we were different.
Isn't that interesting that he literally was indoctrinated into that? You know, you wonder how this sort of thing develops in people's heads, and of course, that was what was Of course, that's how it happened. You know, is that
Right, exactly. So what you have a lot with second generation members is that they've been indoctrinated to see how they're different and how the world is different. And sometimes also there is this dichotomy I've noticed with people who are raised in cults where they're made to feel that they are better than the rest of the world. They live in a higher sphere. They're closer to God or the truth, the answer, whatever else. They're the chosen ones, whatever language they're being fed. But at the same time, within the group, they feel very low. So they're higher than the rest of the world, but they're knocked down within the group, which I'm sure you can relate to, right? And you never quite know how to meet the world face to face and how to just
yeah.
be, you know, that you're
No,
not better than,
absolutely.
you're not less than, you just are a part of the world with everybody else.
Yeah, that's really good way of putting it, and that makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought a lot about um, how the us versus them indoctrination that occurs. I mean, I've thought about that a lot as far as how that occurs in cults, but I
Mm-hmm.
hadn't really thought about what you were just relating it to what you were just talking about with the superiority attitude that with children who would be raised in a group like this, or how they would be told that they are better than other people who are not part of this group and that sort of thing. But of course that happens, and of course I remember, I can remember right now times that happened with me.
Right. And so the confusion, of course, is that if you feel that you're better than these people, but still, once you leave, you're nervous about lowering your status down to, you know, whatever it is, the WOG world or whatever. I don't know. There are all these names, right? Different groups. But still, these people who you look down on seem to know how to get along in the world in a way that you don't. So how do you make sense of that? And you have to actually have this moment of realization or humility where you say, actually, they are going to be my guide through this. I'm going to do some observing. I'm going to watch how people interact with each other. I'm going to notice how, when someone is asked a question, how they get out of not having to answer it. Because I've been trained to answer every question that I've been asked, but sometimes it's nobody's business. How do I find that dividing line between what is private, what is secret, what is okay to share, what's not okay to share, and with whom? All of those things, whom to trust, etc. And if I can trust myself, all those things that are things that second gens often deal with. And you being able to watch how people do it is a really good way to do it. And I'll sometimes tell people to just go watch people talking to each other and be an observer, take notes.
So it's so spot on, such good advice. I can't help, of course, but relate it to my own experience and the fact that the first year I was out, I was Mr. Overshare,
Uh-huh.
in every social situation, life is great, rah, 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 here is everything about me that you never wanted to know, blah, 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 blah. And people would just be like, wow, that dude's really happy, and,
Right.
but I could see how I was making other people uncomfortable, but I couldn't figure out why. And
Mm-hmm.
it took me a long time to even realize, oh, I'm doing this thing that they call oversharing, which in Scientology, that's just how it is. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
don't have secrets from the group, and you're constantly talking about yourself to others, about the most hidden things that you would never just talk about socially. Um, and so it took, and I had to do, it's so funny, just organically learning how to do exactly what you were just talking about, of just, after about a year of this, I realized I was making other people uncomfortable. And so I stopped talking so much and just started listening and watching and trying to adjust my social cues to this new, world, and
Mm.
had to overcome a lot of personal ideas about how they were the ones who were wrong,
Oh,
for
yeah.
not listening to me, or not getting me, or not being able to communicate freely with anyone on any subject, right? One of these Scientology, supposed skills
Right,
that they have, right? And so
right.
I blamed them. It was on them that they weren't getting me, and again, it took a little while to, like, maybe I'm part of this picture too, you know.
Right,
But yeah,
exactly.
so
Yeah.
I totally relate to everything you're talking about here. What have you found to be, I mean, in a broad sense, again, I mean, I'm trying to get into any specific case, but just in a broad sense, what have you found to be the most difficult or challenging aspect of working with second gens?
A couple of things have made it where I see what they're up against and I see the challenges that they face. Um, it's not that um, that they're insurmountable too. I don't want to give that impression that this is sort of a hopeless thing. It's definitely not. But that oftentimes they don't have a sense of who they are, and they need to work on defining this sort of persona that has been trained to be an empty vessel. It's been trained to be trainable. And how do they kind of fill that vessel up with what they know to be true? And that means they are going to have to do some observing. They're going to have to try some things. They're going to have to see what it's like to say no to someone, and see that in the world outside, the same horrible things might not happen to you. And like, that's data that you collect that fills that vessel up, and you get a sense of what's true about you and the world to a much greater degree. So that's something that I know that they really feel really nervous about, because it means taking some risks. And oftentimes within cults, taking risks was fraught with so much potential danger. And so sometimes it takes some doing it slowly, having a friend who has left, who they can talk to from their group or any other, maybe holding their hand as they take these steps, or they have a conversation with someone where they get a product that was faulty and they need to call the manufacturer, and they are just sweating bullets thinking about having any kind of conflict and what that will mean for them and their future and their next life. So everything is of sort of great importance, and again, fraught with potential danger. So what do you do? How do you sort of keep yourself calm throughout this process? Second gens also usually have a very hard time with emotional modulation, because they have been hyper-vigilant. They've learned to be on top of everything happening around them because it's been necessary. So they have a hard time sometimes relaxing, feeling hopeful, finding the humor in something, putting something off till tomorrow. Everything is of utmost importance, and it has to be done, 20 minutes ago or else. And so just learning how to do that modulation inside and breathe, and know that your body is on a fairly regular basis, if not totally, releasing adrenaline in your system. And that's going to cause a lot of physical effects. You're going to have trouble concentrating, sleeping, all of those things that are affected by whatever chemicals are surging in our system that are the fight or flight mechanisms that we had to use when we were in that cult. There was a reason that we had that switch turned on, but we might not need that anymore. So learning how to relax and not feel vulnerable relaxing, because that's the other piece. People are not willing to take off their armor unless they know the war is over. And right, so how do you believe that? You believe that by having those interactions, by proving to yourself that the army isn't about to charge over the hill and you don't have to be at the ready, right? So that's one piece. The other piece is being able to address what happened to you within that group, and also what language to use to define what happened to you. For example, I know a lot of people who are second generation members or former members who were tremendously abused, whether it was physical abuse, emotional, spiritual, verbal, but they didn't know to call it abuse because it just was Tuesday, like that's just how my life is, or that's what it is at home, or that's what I deserved. And so helping them have definitions, knowing how to translate what happened to them and into the vernacular that's used by the rest of the world. Wow, I really was abused. No wonder I have symptoms of post-traumatic stress. Now it makes sense, right? But without knowing what to call what happened to you, you don't know why you're having these symptoms. And then you can combine yourself with the population of people who also have post-traumatic stress. Then you have sort of that connection, right? These are the ways you connect with the people outside, with the people who have had similar experiences. But if you never knew you went through trauma, you wouldn't know that that's why you're experiencing what you're experiencing.
That's a really good point. I'd like to make that point again, actually, to sort of reiterate what you were just talking about there, that it's not about, PTSD and being, an abusive cult, survivor or escapee or whatever. It's not about being a victim. It's about identifying what happened to you so that you can deal with it.
Right.
And I think that's important because, well, certainly in Scientology, and I'm sure it'd be the case with other groups, being a victim is the bad thing. It's the horrible thing. It's purposefully made out to be a how dare you play the victim here? How dare you think you've been victimized by this group? This is the language that's used when you're in the group. And so you come out with these ideas that it can't be a victim, can't be a victim, can't be a victim.
Right.
And so any of these, getting treatment, getting help, getting, even saying, that I'm in recovery, any of that kind of stuff is all playing the victim. And so they can want to do that. And so they, so you don't even go in that direction. But it's not about being a victim at all. It's about... getting yourself back.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up because there's so much to talk about with that. Okay, first of all, yes, Scientology and almost every other group like it, and not like it, but almost every other cult group, even the large group awareness trainings, the self-help kind of groups have this big kind of diagnosis of you that somehow... if something bad has happened to you, then you are playing the victim card, and then you're just showing yourself to be this weak person. It takes an inordinate amount of strength to say what happened to you. It takes an inordinate amount of guts, chutzpah, as we say in business, to say, you know what, actually, I need to talk about this because I'm having nightmares about this. Or there's a whole chunk of my childhood I don't remember because I'm getting glimpses of it, but I think something horrible happened. And I feel like I have to get it out of my system so I can look at it and I can understand it. And I also know then I'll have a better sense of who I can trust and who I can't. Because if I find out these people I'm trusting now were also people who abused me and got away with it, that's going to help me know who I can actually invite into my life now in a safe way or not. Just sharing any kind of negative emotion in a cultic group is so verboten. It's so against anything because the leader can't handle it. It's not that there's anything wrong with it. It's not a sign of weakness. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It just means that the narcissist at the head of this organization doesn't want anyone to complain. And so, right, so then you are told, then there would be something that that would look bad for you. It would be somehow symbolic of something wrong with you if you were to complain. Not at all. It also is something that is so fraught with fear too, because again, if you're having any kind of negative emotions or physical symptoms, depending on the teachings of the group, that's either negative energy, or that's weakness, or that's the devil, or that's you being selfish because you're caring about yourself rather than the cause. Like if you broke your leg and that means you can't go door to door, well, that's just being selfish. right? So when people leave, they don't go to the doctor when they should. They don't come to therapy when they should. they they don't and for good reason. Because what will that mean about them? Well, it doesn't mean anything about them. It's not diagnostic in the least bit. In fact, there is something really wonderful about being able to say, you know what, I'm having pain somewhere, either emotional or physical. I am in charge of this. I'm responsible for this. No one should take that away from me, because at the end of the day, my body's relying on me. My mind is relying on me. And so let me take care of it. Let me step into my own shoes and be in charge, have a sense of agency over my life, over myself. That's actually a very powerful stance, not weak at all, quite the opposite.
Perfect. Yeah, and really, really important. More so than I think a lot of people who are not second gen don't, realize.
Right. Yeah.
I think it's easier for people to shed some of this stuff if they weren't raised with it, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And I don't want to, but let me ask you this, from your perspective as a therapist, and whatever you can say about this, because I can't get too judgmental here or anything, but I'm just kind of curious. Would you say it's easier for people who are, were raised in these groups, or would you say it's easier for the people who got in on their own bat, or would you just say rather than easier, one or the other, is it just different?
Um, hmm. I I want to say it's just different, but I still want to honor the fact that there are more challenges. Again, not insurmountable, but more challenges for people who were raised from a young age in a particular group, um, because of the language that I've heard them use time and time again from people raised on compounds, people who I worked with who were from the FLDS compound, people who were involved in a whole variety of different kind of cultic groups, where they talk about feeling like they were raised on another planet, feeling like a complete fish out of water. Where do they fit in? Where do they belong? They are longing for that other life they had because it was a sense of community and it was all they knew, even if it was horrible to a great degree, because they're not quite sure they have a place here, wherever here is, outside of the group. And so that is quite a challenge. And it takes kind of working through that, and that's certainly, again, something that can be done, but that's something that people who came into a cultic group later on don't experience to the same degree. The challenges for people who came into it later on, though, are unique in that there is oftentimes a greater amount of shame, believe it or not, because there is this blaming of them. How could you have chosen this? As though they
Right.
chose to, right? And how come you couldn't see that it was a cult? We never would have gotten involved in something like that. I mean, really, why are you so gullible? And all that stuff. That when you tell someone your family got involved in something and raised you in it, you're not blamed for that. So you're a little
Right.
free from that. So you still have the guilt on both sides, second gens and the people who got involved later on. You have the guilt oftentimes when you get out of a group, you feel, because you've been told, that you're somehow disappointing the group, that you couldn't hack it, that you're somehow going against the cause or just not caring about the cause anymore. So there's a lot of guilt associated with it. But the shame seems to be a little greater with people who have gotten involved later on, as though they were somehow supposed to take greater responsibility for their lives and they made a bad decision.
Right.
So, it's half a dozen of one, and right. I mean, it's difficult for both, but there is the challenge for people who are born and raised in groups or came in at a young age, to learn about something very important, which is boundaries. They've never had it modeled.
Right.
So people who came in later on had their boundaries totally disrespected or demonized. but they have a memory oftentimes, unless they also came from tremendously abusive and boundaryless kind of situations, which does happen. And for them, I would actually consider them second generation, because they've never been free from something like that. It was sort of like out of the frying pan into the fire. But for second generation members, yeah, you have people who don't know they have a right. Well, period. I'll just put a period. They don't know they have a right. And they don't know they have a right to their bodies and their minds. I remember working with some women who were on the FLDS compound, and some of the social workers there were wanting to talk to them about what their rights were and how they were going to read them, the Bill of Rights, that according to our country, we have all these rights. And I remember saying to them, we're going to have to start a couple paces back, because you're going to not only need to define rights, but you're going to need to convince them that they have them, that they can use them, that nothing bad will happen to them, that it's not against God for them to say no.
Right. That's again, really good points. And again, relating all of this to my own experience, of course,
Yeah.
but trying not to. I'm not trying to make this show about me. I'm just but just thinking all these things through, and that business of rights and personal space and boundaries, man, that is so true. So true. The idea that there's none of that, and having to learn what these things are, and that they are real, and that they're laws, and that these things exist. Speaking of laws, I don't have a set question on this, but I'm curious. It seems that with what's coming out, for example, in the second season here of Leah Remini's show, Scientology in the Aftermath, the first two shows have been pretty devastating about sexual abuse and suicide. On the line of sexual abuse, is it I get the impression, and I guess I'm asking from your experience, it seems that this is more common in these groups than we might like to think. Sexual abuse and maybe with kids especially. Do you have any ideas on that, or what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so it happens more often than is talked about. A lot of people who leave having been through that have a tremendously difficult time disclosing that information. So it's underreported, wildly underreported. But it goes along with what happens so often within these groups. Again, that there is not treating kids like kids, that somehow they're supposed to be cool about whatever and be able to handle it like adults. So that makes people cross over boundaries a lot, just in terms of what happens to them, what happens to their bodies, what information they're exposed to, etc. That we would know is beyond their developmental capacity and developmental safety to be exposed to at such a young age, but within cults that doesn't matter. They are little adults. And then you have the secrecy. So that's going to harbor a lot of bad behavior that people don't know about and also believe they can get away with. And then you also have a change in language about things that is used in this context as well. That it means if an adult is having sex with a child, they are being specially chosen, or that's their spiritual healing, or whatever. It's a lot of other things. And so again, kids might not know that they're being abused, and the people who are in it, who know that they're abusing children, I mean, of course, shame on them. But I think they also know that they can get away with it, because even if a child, let's say, accuse them of something, they could fight back and say, well, this child just was upset because I asked him to do something he didn't want to do. And, that somehow people are not believed within that context sort of depends upon your ranking, right? So that even if you were to say something, it might all fall back on you, that you're a complainer, that you are, you need to be punished for making a false accusation. So people just don't talk about it. So yeah, it happens way more often than we would like to talk about. But what also happens is that there's a lot of exposure to sexual behavior with adults who are being sexual in front of children, in a way that is also making a more sexualized environment for children, which can be traumatizing in its own right. But yeah,
Right.
it does happen quite a bit.
Wow. Yeah. Also, it occurs to me that maybe the adults in these groups feel entitled to this kind of behavior because of that superiority attitude that gets, inculcated in people when they get, they feel special, unique, different from
Mm-hmm.
societies and its rules and its regulations, and they don't know what they're talking about out there, and we've got the real truth, and therefore I'm entitled to do whatever I want,
Right. Exactly.
you know.
Oh, yeah. That entitlement is something that can be very destructive, very dangerous, and is used for people to get away with much more than they should. I think the other part that I've noticed quite a bit is that there are a lot of people who have left groups that they were raised in where they have issues with dissociation, where it is all too easy for them to go into a dissociative place because they're, your mind sort of gives you a little break every once in a while. Because what's happening is you're being exposed to stimuli that is overwhelming for your mind. And that a lot of people will talk about having blacked out or they don't remember. And there's a reason for that. Our mind sometimes will find ways to protect us. The problem is that a lot of people raised in these environments where there was sort of sexual abuse and other sorts of things, is they learn to kind of split themselves off and be somewhere else and not totally take in what was happening to them, not totally feel what was happening to them. So it takes them a while to even remember what happened. And then they're afraid of remembering what happened. I would be, right? I get that.
Totally been there, done that.
Okay.
Totally. Yeah. In fact, I
Yeah.
remember times being in the group and purposefully disassociated myself from what was happening,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because it was just so awful. I just
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to, I just cast my mind somewhere else, went through the motions of whatever work I was being asked to do or whatever experience I was being, experiencing. Some of them pretty abusive stuff, and just sort of, this too will pass, and I just
Mm-hmm.
need to get through this, and sort of just, and I don't even want to remember it or remember much about that, and there have been, things that have boiled to the surface on that kind of stuff. So I get it, totally get it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yep. And I think also along with this idea of what happened at the hands of sometimes parents or other cult leaders is that it interferes with something that's already being interfered with when you are born and raised in a group, which is for a lot of people the sense of attachment or lack of attachment to people who would normally be your caregivers, and people who are supposed to be protecting you, people who shouldn't be letting the monsters in at night, but they do because they don't have a voice themselves, or they have come to believe that this is something that is the best for you. And so it really does affect how much people can be attached to the people who they are supposed to be attached to, and that affects you once you leave as well, and finding yourself kind of being in connection with people, but kind of one foot in and one foot out, because that's what you're used to and that's what's safest. And that when second generation former members talk to me about really developing a new friend, they'll say that that friend has no idea what a huge compliment that is. Because it just seems like someone they got to know at work, but no, just that they got to that point where they could say to someone, I trust you enough that you're not going to hurt me, you're not going to report on me, right? Because there's
Yeah.
no privacy in terms of information, and I can share something with you and it'll be safe. It's huge. It's really huge. And that you're not
Yeah.
going to convince me that you know better than me, or you're not going to take away my rights. I mean, all of those things are built into the relationships as they know them. So to develop a friendship or a love relationship after that is quite big and quite a compliment for the other person.
Big time. Very much so. Let's talk briefly about the parents
Hmm.
of these kids, right? Or these people, the second, third, fourth gens. Um, it is, you know, in these in Leah's last two shows, for example, right? We saw parents behaving very, very badly. You know, the word evil would apply in to some of their actions, but I don't look at them as evil people. I'll differentiate the action from the person because I know specifically about the Scientology mindset and how deep it can go and how fervent it can be. Um, and I say that in a little bit of fear because I don't want to be misunderstood and that I'm not rationalizing or justifying or making their behavior okay. It's
Right. No.
completely unacceptable to, you know, throw your kid under the bus when they're, you know, suicidal, or to, you know, further victimize a child who has been sexually abused by saying it's all your fault.
Hmm.
This is a completely disgusting behavior. But I'm wondering if you could speak to, you know, how that sort of thing happens to these parents. Like, how does it that a cult group can become more significant or important to a person than their own kids?
Okay. It's a very good question because I've seen it in both directions. Now, of course, the show is highlighting where this has happened in one direction,
Very
but
true,
I
actually. Good point. Yeah.
so what I have seen from my practice is that there are people who left a group once they had children because even though they didn't feel they had the right to say no to being abused, they didn't feel that it was their place. They didn't think that they could ever really be right about anything anymore, and that they were just going to listen to what other people said was best for them and true for them, and then they were going to let them get away with a lot. As soon as it was happening to somebody they loved, as soon as they were being told that they needed to also abuse their children because that's the way you show love or that's the way you show God's love or whatever else, as soon as they were told that their child has to be taken away from them and sent to live with the other children and they're never going to see them or rarely going to see them, that's when something switched for them. That they could somehow have something ignited which was about them protecting somebody else, not something that got ignited when they were faced with needing to protect themselves. So I've seen that as well. What I have also seen more often is exactly what's being highlighted on this show. That you have parents who need to believe and also do believe. And that's a distinction for me, that they believe to a certain degree, but also because they've made all these sacrifices, because they have already burned their bridges and said goodbye to people, because they've done a lot to kind of substantiate why they need to be there and why this is the best thing. If they have ever meant what they said, then that also needs to be true for their next generations. Because otherwise, was it just a lie? So I think sometimes they're kind of needing to further the party line and that way of behaving and that way of thinking to prove to themselves that, you know, it was all a good idea. It's still a good idea. But I think also it gives them to a certain degree a rationalization, a way to explain why it is that they can't quite take care of their kids. They can't help to rush to them to, if they fell and they're bleeding and they can't go bring them a Band-Aid, that somehow they need to think about it in another way. And going back to the way of thinking within a cult helps you be free from those moments where it could, you know, you could have your heart torn out. And so I think you get used to being in that kind of programmed dissociative place. Like, this is what's best for my child. I'm not going to take in the evidence of my senses. I'm not going to see that my child is crying and I should go to him or to her. I'm going to remember what I was taught because that makes all of this easier for me. And so that doesn't mean that they're horrible people. I think that just means that they are programmed and they're wanting the programming to kind of continue. They're not seeing it as such. They're seeing it as the answers and they're seeing it as the best way. And I think they're really hoping that it is really the best way. It's when I get, of course, frustrated, and when I think anyone would get critical, is when people are starting to turn and they're starting to notice maybe this isn't the best way. Maybe this wasn't the best way to raise my kids. Maybe I wasn't the parent that I really needed to be. But then the parent will say, but it's too much work now to go back. Or my guilt will be too great and I won't be able to face it. So I'm going to leave my child out kind of swimming on their own because I can't deal with all of this. That's when it becomes a little harder to just sort of understand why they're doing what they're doing. Because then I think it's just escaping from the reality of the situation. And I think it also comes from feeling like you're just not ever going to be able to make it right. There are some parents I've talked to years later who knew that they should have left, who knew that they should have raised their kids differently, who knew they should have protected their kids from a lot more. But it was so awful to have to face that. And they knew about themselves, they just didn't have the capacity to take that on. So they just let everyone keep suffering. It's a hard place for everyone to be in, and it's not created by these parents, so they're not the culprits. They're the victims in the story as much as anyone else. It's just that because they're parents, they're supposed to have a role. They're supposed to have a protective role that they're not playing or they're kept from playing. And that's, about 80 to 90%, that's on the cult.
Right. Okay. Got it on that. It's a very, very, very difficult situation to deal with and to pick up the pieces from afterwards. So looking at that, just moving into the last part of what we're going to talk about today, what resources exist for people who, might be watching this or watching Leah's show or learning about this in the future? In terms of, there's counseling. People can see somebody like you and they can get some help. What else can people do who are, second gen people who have been, who have gotten out of this by hook or crook? They got themselves out. Now what?
Right. Okay. So you want to first do some reading. You want to be able to read books on the subject of people who were born and raised in cults. Luckily now a lot of people have published their stories. So find out that you are not terminally unique. Find out that you have people out there who can relate to your story and you can relate to theirs. Sometimes people also feel guilty when they realize how relieved they are to find out someone else's story was worse. That can happen, and I understand it. Also, you want to be able to go to conferences, like I know the International Occultic Studies Association, Open Minds Foundation, a lot of organizations will also be very generous in giving scholarships to people who don't have the funds to be able to participate, so that you can still be a part of it and you can still learn and you can still learn what happened to you, get the language, learning what happened to you and the after effects, and that really normalizes what you thought you were experiencing that no one else was experiencing, but come to find out you're experiencing almost everything identical to everyone else who has left these similar situations. And then also doing any kind of online forum is very nice because then you can meet each other, be face to face to the best of people's abilities. I have a former cult member support group. I also have parents who are involved in it, who have loved ones still involved in groups, and they're doing what they can to try to free them. So there are different opportunities for people to talk to each other, and I hope one day there will be a fund that people can pull from so that they can pay for services. Years ago, there had been someone who was helping to fund some of my clients who were coming to see me, even though I go down in my fee as much as I can, more than most of my colleagues who are even in this suite. Because I want to make myself available, but at the same time, it would be great if there were if anyone is watching who has the means to be able to pool their resources, and people can then have certain amount of sessions paid for, that would be wonderful. And it would give them a chance to really start on their road to recovery and healing and insight, and being able to relax and feel like they are indeed a part of this world and they deserve to be here just like anybody else.
Perfect. Yeah, I couldn't agree more on all those points. And yeah, setting up a fund like that would be really great, because there are people who need some help. And
Mm.
and unfortunately, people coming out of these kind of groups are not often in a place where they're going to go get the $50,000 a year job right off, and be
Mm.
able to just buy the house and the car and have the life.
Right,
They're
exactly.
struggling, they're
They
picking
are
up the
struggling.
pieces.
Right. And they're worried also about sharing their stories because they've been told something bad is going to happen to them when they tell their story, or something bad is going to happen to the person they're telling it to, which I've talked to you about too, because I still have clients, as you know, check up on me to make sure I got home safely after they told me their story. Because that was another means that the cult leader used to keep everyone quiet. But also, people are very triggered by getting involved in a group. And I know that I've had people who have attended my support group, who have done it online. We'll have a computer screen there because they're just afraid of being in a room, sitting in a circle of people, because that was horrendous. They were publicly shamed in these environments. They were made to feel horrible, or they had to sit there for 17 hours without a bathroom break, or, it brings up a lot of memories. And so there's a lot of kind of checking me out to make sure that I'm going to be a safe person for people to talk to. I know I had someone recently who started in my support group, and when she was introducing herself, she said, "I'm really glad to be attending this support group. It took me 6 years to get here." So of course I'm thinking it's LA, right? Like, wow, traffic must be really bad. But I said, I understand. I understand that it took you 6 years. And no matter how long it took, I'm glad you're here. But it's a real issue. People stay quiet and they stay silent and they stay afraid. And then they don't get the healing they need.
Big time. Big time. Well, Rachel, thank you very much for sharing some of your time with us on this topic. I think it's an important one, and I think it will only keep getting bigger as maybe as Leah's show continues rolling out, as other exposés and documentaries are done, and as more of this comes to light. I think we really are seeing in the last 10 years or so a real shift in view about these groups and
Mm-hmm.
about the damage that they do, and
Mm-hmm.
about why it is that people need to be on their guard in getting involved with some of these groups.
Oh,
And
yeah.
and now we're seeing that go into the earlier generation, the kids of these people, and what
Mm-hmm.
effects did these groups have on them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is only going to continue rolling out,
Yeah,
as we do this.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, so you've been really great, and definitely a friend of this show. So very happy to have you on board. So thanks again for taking the time, and we're just out of time at this point, so we're going to wrap up the show for this week. But I will definitely look forward to having you on again.
Sounds great. And thank you for inviting me to talk about this issue. It is a big issue and a growing issue. The longer cults have been around as we recognize them. So we're going to have third, fourth, fifth generations, sixth generations. It will continue. So yeah, it's very important that people understand what the issues are here.
Big time. Okay, well, thanks again, and everybody, leave me your feedback, comments, notes, good, bad, or sideways, in the show notes here on YouTube down below, or on the sensiblyspeaking.com website, and I will put a link to Rachel's website there, so you can contact her directly if you would so desire, with any other questions you might have from what we were talking about today. Thanks for coming around, and I will see you guys next week.